Allied and Axis naval forces. Open sea, late war. 1944, 1945. Night minutes before contact. Naval Command, expected time. Not hours, just minutes. Enough for decisions to matter. Enough space between first contact and real consequences for reports to come in, orders to go out, and formations to respond as something deliberate rather than purely instinctive. That assumption shaped everything. On the bridges, officers watched their instruments and the darkness with practiced calm. Radios murmured routine updates. Signal lamps stood ready. Flags were stowed, but within reach. The fleet moved forward believing that when the battle began, it would unfold step by step. First contact, then confirmation, then command. That sequence had defined naval warfare for generations. By the final years of the war, it was no longer guaranteed. Beyond visual range, detection had already happened. Bearings were fixed, speeds calculated, fire control solutions were forming, not through spoken orders or handwritten notes, but inside systems moving faster than any human chain of command. The battle was already taking shape before anyone said a word. On the command ships, nothing yet reflected that reality. No alarms sounded. No urgent course changes were ordered. Command still believed it was guiding a situation that was developing, not stepping into one that was already decided. That was the fatal delay. The first shells did not arrive as an opening move. They arrived as a verdict. Multiple ships were hit within seconds. Impacts overlapped so closely that reports blurred together. Steel tore open, fires erupted. Shockwaves raced through hulls faster than words could travel over a radio. Inside the command center, operators struggled to make sense of what they were hearing. Damage reports came in out of sequence, bearings conflicted, requests for clarification piled up faster than they could be answered. Officers leaned over maps that were already out of date. Orders were written. They were accurate. They were also too late. By the time the first signals left the command ship, the situation they addressed no longer existed. Ships had already maneuvered on instinct. Some had lost power, others were burning. The battle was moving faster than the language meant to control it. That was the defining feature of the engagement. Fire moved at the speed of calculation. Command moved at the speed of transmission. The gap between them decided everything. The second wave of shells arrived before the first orders were even acknowledged. Then a third. Target corrections happened instantly, guided by data rather than discussion. Ships were struck again before crews could finish reporting the first hit. Signals kept going out. Course changes. Formation adjustments. Fire directives. Each one obsolete by the time it was received. Command had not failed to act. It had simply been outrun. What naval leadership expected to be a controlled exchange became something closer to a collapse of sequence itself. There was no single moment when command lost control, because control never arrived in time to be used. The battle did not unfold. It compressed. By the time signal flags were raised or radios finished transmitting, ships were already sinking, burning, or drifting beyond recovery. The engagement ended not because one side withdrew, but because nothing remained that could still respond to instruction. Naval Command had expected a long fight. Instead, it witnessed something new. A battle that ended before orders could change. Because by the time they did, the war had already moved on without them. The expectation of a long engagement didn't come from optimism. It came from experience. For decades, naval combat followed a rhythm commanders understood and trusted. Even sudden encounters tended to move through familiar phases. Detection led to maneuver led to exchange, and between those exchanges, there were pauses, brief moments when information could catch up with events. Naval doctrine was built around those pauses. Reports moved up the chain, orders moved back down. Even in chaotic fights, there was usually enough time between salvos for leadership to step in a meaningful way. Ships could reposition, fire could be redirected, damage could be assessed before the next decision truly mattered. Late in the war, technology quietly broke that rhythm. Radar removed uncertainty, but it also removed delay. Once contact was made, range and bearing stabilized almost immediately. Fire control systems no longer waited for visual confirmation. They generated firing solutions continuously, correcting in real time as shells landed. The battle no longer waited for humans to catch up. Naval Command, however, was still operating on assumptions formed earlier in the war. Communications, radio, signal lamps, flags were fast, but not simultaneous. Messages still had to be spoken, received, acknowledged, interpreted, and acted on. Each step took seconds. Those seconds used to exist. In this engagement, they didn't. Command expected time because doctrine said time would be there. Training assumed it. Past battles reinforced it. Even improvements in accuracy were seen as making combat deadlier, not fundamentally faster. What changed wasn't just firepower. It was tempo. Fire no longer paused for reaction. As soon as one salvo landed, the next correction was already forming. Targets shifted faster than reports could be completed. Ships entered crisis all at once instead of one after another. That shattered prioritization. Command centers were flooded with information faster than it could be processed. Damage reports overlapped. Bearings conflicted. Requests for orders piled up faster than responses could be issued. The overall picture broke apart into fragments that never came back together. Orders were still produced logically. But logic depends on sequence. The battle no longer had won. By the time Command realized events were outrunning communication, that understanding arrived as damage, not insight. Ships were already burning before their situations could be plotted. Maneuvers were already underway before approval could be given. Command had expected time because time had always been there. Late-war naval combat erased it without warning. And once time was gone, Command lost the one resource it had always relied on to turn information into control. The first salvos didn't throw the battle off balance. They locked it into place. Multiple ships were hit within seconds of one another, so close in time that no single impact could be treated as the beginning. Damage reports followed almost immediately, arriving together, each demanding urgent attention, each describing a crisis that couldn't wait its turn. The command process was overwhelmed from the start. Naval Command is built to sequence responses, identify the most serious threat, allocate resources, issue instructions. That structure collapsed when every ship became the top priority at the same moment. Fire didn't recognize hierarchy. Radar-guided gunnery adjusted almost instantly. The moment shells landed, corrections followed, walking fire across formations with mechanical precision. There was no pause to assess results, no lull for command to absorb what was happening. By the time a report was spoken into a microphone, the ship was already facing its next problem. That created a deadly delay. Orders weren't ignored, they were overtaken. Ships received instructions aimed at conditions that had already changed. Some captains tried to follow them anyway, only to find the maneuver pointless or even dangerous. Others acted without waiting. This wasn't insubordination. It was necessity. Crews responded to what they could see and feel: fire, flooding, power loss, because those realities demanded immediate action. Waiting for orders meant giving up seconds that no longer existed. Coordination fractured. Ships maneuvered on their own. Fire was returned in isolation. Formation coherence dissolved not from panic, but from speed. There simply wasn't time to align intent. Communication systems buckled under the load. Radios filled with overlapping transmissions. Signal lamps flashed into smoke that swallowed the light. Acknowledgements arrived late or not at all. The harder command tried to speak, the less influence its words carried. This was the moment naval leadership realized something fundamental had changed. Firepower no longer waited for command. And command could no longer catch up to firepower. The battle was being decided in the narrow space between detection and impact, a space that no longer allowed for speech, hierarchy, or approval. By the time revised orders were ready, the engagement had already moved past them. The ships hadn't failed to listen. They simply had no time to hear. Command didn't fall silent as the battle accelerated. It spoke more. Signals multiplied, course changes, formation adjustments, fire directives, each one trying to impose order on a fight that no longer paused long enough to accept it. From the command ship, this felt like control under pressure. From the ships receiving those signals, it felt like instructions arriving from the past. The issue wasn't clarity. Most orders were easy to understand, some were even sound in principle. What they lacked was relevance to the moment they arrived. A ship ordered to turn had already turned to avoid a collision. A ship told to increase speed had already lost propulsion. A unit instructed to concentrate fire could no longer identify a shared target. The battle had shifted from direction to reaction. Command assumed ships would wait for instructions before acting. Late war combat punished that assumption. Captains who waited lost seconds they couldn't afford. Captains who acted immediately often found themselves contradicting orders that arrived moments later. Urgency collided with hesitation. Crews began to wonder which reality mattered more, the radio message or the deck beneath their boots. Fire spreading through compartments felt more urgent than a signal lamp blinking through smoke. Flooding demanded action now, not after acknowledgement. So ships acted locally. Not out of defiance, but out of survival. That decentralization accelerated fragmentation. Formation integrity dissolved as ships maneuvered independently. Fire was returned in isolated bursts instead of concentrated volleys. The fleet stopped behaving like a single organism and started behaving like a collection of simultaneous emergencies. Command tried to adapt. Orders were shortened. Authority was delegated. Captains were given latitude to act as they saw fit. But even delegation took time to transmit, and by the time it did, many ships were already beyond the point where autonomy could change the outcome. This was where leadership met its limit. Command exists to shape what happens next. In this battle, the future arrived too fast. Leadership could describe what should happen, but not quickly enough to influence what was already happening. The effect was unsettling. There was no dramatic breakdown, no shouted refusals, no visible collapse of discipline. The system simply stopped responding to instruction because instruction couldn't keep up. That's why the battle felt strangely impersonal. Ships were lost not because the wrong orders were given, but because no order issued at that speed could matter. The war had outrun its own command structures. By the time senior officers understood that signals were no longer shaping outcomes, the engagement had already entered its final phase. Orders were still sent. They just no longer landed anywhere that mattered. What finally broke coordination wasn't confusion. It was simultaneity. In earlier battles, ships were damaged one at a time. Command could focus its attention, assign assistance, and manage the response in sequence. This time, multiple ships entered crisis at once. Fires erupted across different decks, in different parts of the formation. Flooding spread in parallel. Power failed without warning. Every problem demanded priority. None could receive it. Damage control teams weren't overwhelmed by how severe the damage was, but by how much of it happened at the same time. Pumps were needed everywhere. Backup power was needed everywhere. Medical aid was needed everywhere. There was no reserve, no untouched ship to draw resources from. Command couldn't triage. Any attempt to save one ship meant abandoning another facing the same danger. That reality forced a harsh conclusion. Outcomes would be decided locally, not centrally. The crews understood this almost immediately. They stopped waiting for help that wasn't coming. They fought fires with whatever equipment was at hand. They sealed compartments knowing no reinforcement would arrive. They abandoned gun positions not because of orders, but because heat and smoke made them unusable. The battle lost its hierarchy. Instead of command directing events, physics took over. Fire spread where fuel was available. Water moved where hulls were breached. Smoke filled spaces where ventilation failed. None of these forces waited for permission. Incoming fire exploited that perfectly. Radar-guided gunnery shifted toward ships that still showed signs of function, those still maneuvering, still firing back, still regaining power. Each time a ship brought one crisis under control, another impact created a new one somewhere else. Recovery never caught up. That's why the engagement shortened instead of dragging on. The more damage accumulated at the same time, the fewer options remained. With each passing minute, more ships slipped out of the category of still able to act. Command had expected a long fight because long fights allow adaptation. This battle denied adaptation by compressing damage into overlapping waves. There was no pause, no moment to breathe, assess, and reform. By the time some ships realized they were no longer part of a coordinated force, that realization arrived as silence on the radio. Not because communications had completely failed, but because there was nothing left to coordinate. There came a moment when the fight stopped being about combat and became about consequence. It wasn't announced, no signal marked it. It arrived quietly when damage control stopped producing real improvement. Fires were no longer being pushed back, only held for short periods. Flooding slowed, then crept in again. Power flickered on and off, never staying long enough to matter. That was the point of no return. Late war warships were built with redundancy, but redundancy depends on time. It assumes one system can fail while another carries the load long enough for repairs to take hold. Here, multiple systems failed at once. Damage control teams couldn't isolate problems because problems were everywhere. The crews kept working. And that effort mattered, but it wasn't enough. Every success was temporary. A fire brought under control flared up again when ventilation failed. A flooded compartment refilled when pumps lost power. A repaired circuit burned out after the next hit shook the ship. Incoming fire made sure nothing ever stabilized. The moment a ship showed signs of recovery, lights coming back on, engines responding, it drew attention. Another salvo followed. Another system failed. Recovery was punished faster than it could accumulate. This is how ships stopped fighting without actually sinking. They stayed afloat, but they were functionally dead. Guns fell silent not because ammunition ran out, but because power or targeting did. Engines went idle not by order, but through damage. Radios went quiet not because no one tried to speak, but because there was nothing useful left to say. By then, command no longer mattered. The battle was being decided by material limits, not intention. The ships were still present, but their ability to influence events had been stripped away. And once recovery was no longer possible, the engagement could only move one way. Toward stillness. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It settled in. Gunfire faded, not because ammunition was gone, but because firing no longer changed anything. The targets that mattered had already been hit. The ship still afloat no longer moved in ways that drew attention. Movement itself stopped having value. A drifting ship wasn't a threat. A burning ship couldn't maneuver. A silent ship was already finished. That's why the sea went quiet. Not because of a ceasefire. Because the work was done. Crews sensed it before they fully understood it. The lack of incoming fire felt wrong, almost undeserved. No one believed the danger had passed, yet nothing followed. Smoke thinned. The night slowly reclaimed its darkness. The radios grew quieter. Not because they had failed, but because there was nothing left to coordinate. Each ship existed inside its own aftermath, cut off by damage and silence. The battle ended without a transition. There was no pursuit, no withdrawal, no order to regroup. Just absence. For men trained to expect a next phase, counterattack, consolidation, retreat, the stillness was deeply unsettling. War usually moves, even defeat has direction. This didn't. The sea simply stopped asking anything of them. And that quiet was more disturbing than the gunfire had ever been. Command only fully understood what had happened after it was over. Not in the middle of the fight. Not even in its final moments. Afterward, reports came together slowly. Timelines had to be rebuilt from fragments. Officers compared notes and began to see the same pattern everywhere. Orders had gone out correctly and arrived too late to matter. The conclusion was uncomfortable. There had been no catastrophic blunder, no single decision that doomed the fleet. The system itself had simply been overtaken by speed. Command doctrine assumed influence could be applied during the battle. This engagement proved that influence now had to exist before the first shot, or not at all. Once firing began, events moved faster than language could keep up. That forced a painful reassessment. Communications hadn't failed in a technical sense. Radios worked. Signals went through. The failure was one of timing. The chain of command could no longer operate fast enough to shape events. Leadership hadn't been wrong. It had been irrelevant. That realization was harder to accept than defeat itself. It meant future battles could no longer depend on mid-fight correction. The real window for decision had moved earlier into planning, positioning, and anticipation. By the time command fully understood what this engagement had revealed, the lesson was already clear. Naval warfare had crossed a threshold, and command would either adapt to that reality or keep arriving too late. With daylight, the ocean revealed what the night had concealed. Debris drifted quietly on the surface. Oil spread in thin, wavering sheets. Hulls lay crippled or adrift where tight formations had existed only hours before. The water itself looked unchanged, calm, indifferent. There was no second act. No renewed contact. No regrouping. No movement toward anything at all. The survivors didn't talk about retreat or escape. They talked about endings, about how suddenly the fight had stopped demanding decisions. What unsettled them most was how brief it had been. A battle expected to last hours had been decided in minutes, not through brilliant maneuver or dramatic turns, but through compression. Damage arrived faster than thought. Fire outran command. Silence followed almost immediately. The sea offered no explanation. Only absence. This battle didn't end because one side surrendered. It ended because there was nothing left that could still respond. Naval Command had expected a long engagement because long fights leave room for leadership to matter. This one offered no such space. Firepower moved at the speed of calculation. Communication moved at the speed of speech. Speech lost. Orders weren't ignored. They were outpaced. Ships weren't defeated through mistakes or hesitation, but through a collapse of sequence itself. When events move faster than instruction, outcomes arrive before intention ever can. That was the defining feature of this fight. The battle was over before signals could change, not because command failed, but because the war itself had changed the rules. In late-war naval combat, control no longer lived in the middle of the fight. It existed before it began. And once fire started moving faster than words, the sea decided everything on its own.